In this video, I'm going to talk about life and death at Willard, the former mental health facility in upstate New York, and the massive amount of human suffering that took place there. It started as an insane asylum for the so-called incurables, and then transitioned to a prison for addicts. But that's closed now too. Willard is mostly a ghost town with about 1,000 acres on Seneca Lake, but there are some residents who still live there. This is a tale of horror, hauntings, forced gynecological exams, underground tunnels, electroshock therapy, and drugging. More than 50,000 mental health patients went through Willard in the years it was open, and almost 6,000 of them are buried in its private cemetery. Some say the spirits of the deceased still haunt the place to this day. One of the reasons I am so passionately interested in the history of Willard is because my husband worked there from the time it opened as a drug treatment campus in 1995 until his recent retirement. And I've just always been fascinated by that place. I even was given some documents from superintendent who has now since passed away that record some of the history, and I will use some of the photographs in this documentation in this video as I speak. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. They say that the past never truly dies, and nowhere is that more evident than at Willard. If you're traveling along the east side of Seneca Lake, you can drive through this campus and see what I'm talking about. The buildings are all locked and fenced in, but if you could walk through the empty halls, you'd probably feel the weight of those who suffered there. There's an eerie imprint on this vast property. The place is thought to be haunted and has even been featured in a couple paranormal TV shows. What was life like for patients when it was an asylum and then the New York State Psychiatric Hospital? It all started back in 1869, and that was a long time ago. For more about its start, watch my first video. I'll post the link below. The small village of Willard was once a hub of activity. When it was open, it was a place of last resort for people deemed throwaways, the incurably insane, or criminal addicts. When Willard started, there was no true mental health treatment. There was only custodial care, food, shelter, clothing. Almost all were totally destitute. For most, the days were routine, monotonous, and repetitive. There were some breaks, for example, movies and occasional theater performances, but most days for these patients was pretty tedious. Patients were doomed to live out their lives there, never to leave, and no one escaped except for death. Some were suicidal, and there are rumors of those who drowned themselves in the lake. And in 1885, the first woman doctor was hired. Now, back then, a woman's mental health was considered tied to her female organs, her womb, her uterus, hence the term hysterical or hysterectomy, which is derived from the Greek hyster. So when a woman cried or was irrational or had emotional outbursts, they thought it was because of her uterus. So this woman doctor was hired to give gynecological exams and keep extensive records on the female patients. And these exams were not welcomed. Despite this, every woman was subjected to this regardless of her medical condition. Let's talk about life at Willard. Able-bodied patients were offered work and recreation to offset an otherwise bleak and dismal existence. In fact, there was an annual field day, which was the highlight of the year. It drew in hundreds of locals. It was a really big deal for the surrounding community and a chance for patients to interact with the outside world. Cooperative patients were allowed to leave the wards and walk the campus or work in the outbuildings, but they were always under the watchful eye of the attendants. Those who were considered violent or a flight risk were housed in back wards under tighter scrutiny with less freedom. In 1893, Hadley Hall was built, and that was a huge brick building with a 500-seat auditorium and even a bowling alley. Dances, concerts, church services, and lectures were held there, and patients flocked to these events, eager for a chance to escape the monotony of their daily routines. In the 1920s, there were Monday night movies of films like Spook Ranch, Love Hour, The Siege, and The Iron Horse. Now, I'm not trying to say that all patients at Willard were mistreated. That's simply not true. There were many great staff and volunteers over the years who provided provided outstanding and humane care for these patients. But at times there were outbreaks of diseases such as influenza, tuberculosis, diphtheria, and typhoid, which took the lives of not only the patients but staff too. Let's talk about electroshock therapy. So during the 1930s and 40s, electroshock therapy dominated the treatment of the facility. Here's a transcript of Nancy Jaycott Caniff being interviewed by someone years later. I'm not sure exactly when. I started working there back when they used to line up for shock treatment. And they had what they called the Blitz. And you'd go in and you'd have your shock treatment. And they'd line up the chairs in the hallway, and there'd probably be 15 or 20 people. You had people holding you down, and they had this big thing that they put in the mouth. Now, if you have shock treatments, they give you a sedative. Back then, they didn't. So in the 1950s, besides electroshock therapy, they used ice baths, insulin shock therapy, and the drugs started in the 50s too. Overwhelmed staff needed crowd control. And in 1955, this new neuroleptic wonder drug called Thorazine came on the scene. Doctors at Willard were cautiously optimistic because they'd seen devastating effects of the older treatments and they wanted to try something new. So they began administering Thorazine to the severely disturbed patients, and to their surprise, it seemed to work. The patients became calmer, more manageable, and more cooperative. It seemed like a wonder drug. But as time went on, the staff realized that Thorazine, it had a dark side. Yes, it calmed the patients, but it left them subdued, docile, and resigned to quiet hopelessness. But the use of Thorazine continued and increased, and it went on with some patients for years and even decades. In the aftermath of World War II, exposés of the deplorable conditions in state hospitals, including Willard, brought public scrutiny. Investigative committees at state and national levels recommended downsizing these state hospitals and providing more treatment out in the communities. By the 1960s, Willard offered new services aimed at releasing these long-stay patients. Many at that point were elderly, and after decades of being locked away, they were in no condition to return to the communities as independent citizens. Instead, the hospital staff tried to prepare them for transfer to foster homes or nursing facilities. Most of these patients at that point had become so elderly and habituated to hospital life that they struggled how to live in a world that had changed so drastically since they had last lived free in it. I did a video on the Willard Cemetery with the unnamed graves. If you haven't seen it, I'll leave the link below, and please subscribe to my channel for more. Now, let's talk about what's underground at Willard. I have information that there are underground tunnels at Willard. They're called steam tunnels. Apparently, it's a network of tunnels that connects the buildings with tunnels from the basements down underground. Back around 1900, I believe, there were boiler systems put in place for heating, and these tunnels were created for the pipes of hot water that fed through to heat the various buildings. And apparently, these tunnels are big enough, or were big enough, for people to walk through. I heard that for decades, these tunnels were used to transport people and items from building to building underground in bad weather. So here's another thing. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was having dinner at a local restaurant, and I was in a conversation with some friends about Willard. There was this man nearby who was apparently eavesdropping on our conversation. I'll never forget this. He piped up to tell us that he had been down in the Willard tunnels doing some kind of, I don't know, contractor construction work, and that he had seen a demon in one of those tunnels. Now, it's true, he seemed like he had a few drinks in him, but he was quite emphatic about it. He kind of went on and on about it. And, Willard does have a history for creepy things going on. In fact, have been 2 paranormal TV crews that have come out, Destination Fear and Paranormal State. I have 2 other quick tales to tell that locals know. One is about the lady in red, or maybe it's the lady with the red hair. I'm not quite sure which yet. And the other is the doctor in the brown suit. But to hear those, you'll have to subscribe and watch my next video about Willard DTC, the drug treatment campus. So please subscribe and hit that notification bell, and thanks for watching.